Hello, and welcome to Glory Be, interesting people and how they pray.
Each week, we chat with interesting people about their lives, their work, and how they pray. I'm Sharon Hanish.
And I'm Mike Malcolm. Father Vince is on vacation this week. This week, we welcome Father Vic Galier from the Archdiocese of Atlanta. He grew up in Oklahoma City and found himself as the pastor of a large Black Catholic church in Atlanta. Welcome, Father Vic.
Welcome, Father Vic.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for having me.
So what is your story? How'd you get from Oklahoma to Atlanta?
So I grew up in Moore, went to St. Andrews in Moore, and when I went to college, I went to Oklahoma State. Go Pokes.
Go Pokes.
And while I was there, I started to discern a vocation. And since universities were seen as centers for vocations, I looked at the Diocese of Tulsa and actually joined the Diocese of Tulsa because my father was a deacon in Oklahoma City. And even though he had been dead for a while, went off to school to St. Meinrad to study, finished up my college program. And while I was there, I discerned maybe I needed to go someplace else in Oklahoma. Thought about missionary orders and then decided that wasn't right. And then Atlanta offered me the chance to come and live and work here for a while and fell in love with Atlanta. And I've been here since 1993 and never looked back.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, how did you get assigned as pastor of your current church?
So the pastoring a Black parish is not like pastoring any other parish. It's a cultural difference. And one of the things that I would say is there aren't, every priest is not cut out to pastor a Black parish. And certainly different priests have different gifts. Some priests have a gift for understanding Latinx cultures and, speak Spanish and can do well there. And I guess the Archbishop saw in me something that I could be the pastor here at St. Anthony of Padua. And even though when he called me and asked me about it, I said, Archbishop, I appreciate the opportunity. However, I've never preached in the Black context. I've never worked with Black Catholics. I'm not sure I'm your guy. And he said to me, Victor, he said, go and be yourself. He said, and they will love you. And they have. So I've been here 9.5 years, and now I wonder where I can go after here. So.
Yeah.
What is distinct about a Black parish?
Well, just kind of to preface it, Black Catholics are not a monolith, just like Black folks in the United States are not a monolith. Not only do I have a number of African Americans, but I also have Caribbean Americans and Africans who are parishioners. And so there's there is some variety in the parish, but mostly Black Catholics. So a lot of it is just kind of the different Catholic centers around the United States where Black Catholics have been, Chicago, Louisville, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Mobile, those sorts of places have their own sort of way of being. And so Mass is more of a cultural celebration than it is more so of what you would get at most Catholic parishes. And when I say most Catholic parishes, I'm referring mostly to just kind of white Catholic churches. I don't mean to say that the church is white, because that's one thing we fight frequently about in my ministry. But it is about, it's a different feel. Liturgy has a different feel, and music has a different feel. The rhythm has a different feel. Preaching has a different feel, and even inside of that, there are no two Black Catholic parishes that are the same. Even when I was in Tulsa, there were two Black Catholic churches that were maybe 3 or 4 miles apart, and they liturgically very different.
Mm-hmm.
Was it St. Monica?
St. Monica, St. Augustine.
Yeah, St. Augustine. I don't know if it's still like that. I was there with Father Joe
Townsend.
Townsend, yeah, great guy, great pastor. And so they're not a monolith, but it's certainly very different than most white parishes are. And it's a lot of the cultural kind of setting of things.
How did you prepare yourself for it? I mean, I know the Archbishop said just be yourself, but you want to try to allow the church to change you a little bit, right?
Yeah, I was just finishing a degree in another master's in Catholic social teaching. And when I got the word, I had reached out to a number of Black priests that I knew saying, hey, looks like I'm going to St. Anthony. What do I need to read? What do I need to know? And so they had me read like Cyprian Davis's History of Black Catholics in the United States, which I had read while we were at Meinrad. But, reading things when you're 20 years old in college and then reading them again when you're almost 40 are very different perspectives. And so that was very enlightening. There are a couple different anthologies, one by Sean Copeland and others about the Black Catholic experience. I read Brian Massengill's book on racism in the Catholic Church. So there were a number of books that people were like, here, read this. at that point, when you're in graduate school, reading 800 pages a week that's just that's called every week. So when I got done with my thesis, I took mostly that month of April when I had done all my reading for my thesis and could add them in. I added in books, about one a week, and even read some Black liberation theologians, Coyne and others, because that was important to learn about the people I was going to be in ministry with. So one of the things that I tell people is, even with all of my reading, I came in here with a number of biases that I had to confront. Plus, I also had a number of thoughts that were just not real. Like one thing I will say is, I think when I came here and someone were to say to me, "Oh, Black culture and white culture are different," I would say, no. I mean, how can they be? I mean, it's a white dominant culture. It'd be very difficult to carve out your own little thing. Maybe some things, but not different. And what I came to realize was kind of like Harry Potter, between the Muggle world and the Wizarding world. Yes, they exist side by side, but you're just not aware of half of the things that happen that are not part of, or were not part of my growing up as a white guy in the United States. And thankfully, I've had great parishioners who've taught me, those sorts of important lessons about the difference between culture, because there are lots of cultural differences between Black culture and white culture in the United States. I mean, there are cultural differences even between, here living in Georgia and living in Oklahoma, how we deal with things. I mean, Mexican restaurants here are horrible. You don't get free chips, you don't get free tortillas, you don't get free cheese put on the table, none of that stuff. And so when I go home, I always want that. So, I mean, I recognize that culture is fairly fluid, but Black culture was one that almost was like the Wizarding world, kind of there, but I didn't know what it was, and you can't really tap into it. And one of the ways that caused problems was talking about things during homilies, what would be an appropriate analogy to make. Not that it would be offensive, but that it would just be like, I mean, if I were to say, well, ladies, I mean, like at my old parish, I would always say, what's that guy's name? He was like Brad Pitt. I'd say, oh, well, let's say Brad Pitt was here, something like that. Here, if I said Brad Pitt, they'd be like, nah, But now if I say in my homily, Idris Elba, they'd be like, well, now you're talking about someone if Idris Elba was here, how would you act? They're like, oh, well, Father, I want to, put on my better hair and all these things. So I had to learn culturally a number of things, and that was one of them is that. So I tried to read as much as I could and come with an open mind, and even my best attempts at being open-minded to things, I still had lots and lots and lots to learn, lots and lots and lots to learn. So
I noticed that you're doing you have a task force to study racism. Is that right, at your parish?
Yeah. So COVID is affecting everyone, as you know, right now. It came with its own stressors, and when George Floyd happened, it caused this seismic shift in the Black community. And I don't know if you've ever done any of the strengths finders or things like that, but one of my big gifts is empathy. Like, I can tell when people are hurting, and like I tell people, just because I know you're hurting doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to do anything about it. I just know you're hurting. So, but I could tell in my parishioners that things were going poorly with George Floyd, when Ahmaud Arbery got killed here in Georgia, and when Breonna Taylor was murdered in Louisville. All of those things were moments for lots of my parishioners to say, see, we've been telling you the police are against us. The police are more violent with us. The police are more difficult with us than they are with white people. And it was at that point where they said, I'm just done. I'm just done. You've seen this in folks, I'm sure, who are up and then lost their car and didn't know what to do and how are they going to save the house and feed the kids and things like that. And they're just mentally, they're stressed because there's no clear future. And with COVID kind of leaving an unsure future, and then racism kind of rearing its ugly head, then it became almost too much. And on we do Zoom calls every Sunday after Mass. And one of the calls, people just started sharing their stories of pain. And I said, why don't we break off into some rooms? And I put everyone into a room about 4 or 5. And I was I'm the tech guy here at the parish, so I'm jumping in and out of the rooms, checking on everybody, make sure it's going well. And I would say in every room I jumped into, there was 1 or 2 people crying, and they weren't doing well with this. And so they, without my pressing, they said, hey, let's form an ad hoc committee and help our parishioners the best we can during this time. Because again, even my best intention plans, I'm not going to formulate or do enough for them in their particular cultural setting. And thankfully, I have fantastic parishioners who are very thorough and have done amazing work. And so that's how that kind of got started. And now we've had, I think, 4 phone calls with the ad hoc committee on racism, and they're doing a couple things on racism, a couple other things just to kind of take care of parishioners, which is great. And that's separate from pastoral council, separate from finance council, although they've come to give us a report. Even this past week, they sent a letter to the Archbishop asking him to make some policy changes in the Archdiocese, because as you know, we can keep working to try to change people's hearts, but policy is where things get changed. And once policies can get changed and people can come, can get in line with what's going on with the policy or not. And, hopefully people have a change of heart once they understand this is the new policy, this is how it's going. So that group is they've been working towards that and supporting one another through this very, very difficult time.
What's an example of a policy that might change?
Well, one thing that they could do is here in the Archdiocese is reinstating the Office of Black Catholic Ministry. It's kind of been subsumed under the Office of Multicultural Ministry, which is good, but it gets Black Catholics and some other smaller groups subsumed into this larger multicultural mix, which for our area has a lot of Latinx folks in it. And so that's a huge focus of the office. But Black Catholics are ones who are, they have gotten kind of the short end of the stick. Like even at our annual Eucharistic Congress, there's been a tract for Vietnamese, there's been a tract for Spanish, there's been a tract for teens, young adults, kids, adults, but no Black Catholic track, no bringing in Black Catholic speakers to talk, no bringing in music, things like that, other than to just kind of, I don't want to call it like a minstrel show, but just kind of bringing people out to be like, hey, look, now we got Black singers up here. They brought in Black speakers, but they weren't speaking to Black Catholics as much as they were speaking to, hey, here's something for everybody. So one of the changes that they've asked for is for the Archbishop to be, have some response to why this happened, even though it didn't happen under his administration, but to say why shouldn't it be? Because the common message that I got last week on our Zoom call was that even though the church kind of is like, yes, we want you close, but don't bring your culture too much into play here. They still remain Catholic, because a lot of Catholics here in my parish have been Catholics since birth. I have one lady in my parish who came from Louisville, Kentucky. We didn't have the chapel like we do over at the historically Black colleges here, Morehouse and Spelman and Clark, which is less than a mile away from me. So she, being a good little Catholic girl, Sunday morning, got dressed up, headed to church, walked in the door, and when she walked in, she says, everyone turned and looked at me, and she says, I realized then I was the only Black person in the church. And she said, and I didn't return for 20 years because they made her feel so unwelcome. So it's finding places, it's finding Black spaces where people feel comfortable being, Black. And I've had folks who've come to church here who are white folks who, got upset. I think it was after, this is soon after Black Lives Matter really started. And we had a guest priest in for Men's Day, and he started talking about Black Lives Matter. And this family wrote me this letter. They said, that's all well and good, but what about the white families? And what about them and their needs and things like that? And, they didn't send it wasn't a letter addressed to be replied to. It was just, hey, we've come to your church for a while, now we're leaving, and here's why. And I, when I saw that family, a couple of years later, I'm like, I hope you all found a good church that, meets all your needs, because what they were wanting was this church to change to meet their needs and not confront them with the issues of racism and things like that are going on in our world. So those are some of the policy things that I think we need to make Black spaces available for Catholics to be able to worship, much like we do Portuguese brothers and sisters and our deaf and Chinese and all the different cultural things, because they're not your cookie cutter white bread parish, and I think the easiest way for us to see that is if you look at parishes there in the Diocese of Tulsa, where they have a very thriving ministry to Latinx folks. It's almost as if they're two parishes running side by side. They kind of turn on, and now we're the space for the brown folks, and now we're the space for the white people, and you can tell what a priority it is, because think of all the parishes who have Mass in Spanish, and what times are those Masses? 1:30, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They get the worst times. And so the question comes, what's the priority of outreach to Hispanics or Latinx folks and, in the church? And culturally, we have a lot of room to grow. I mean, we've done a lot of growing, but the church still has a lot of inherent racism going on inside. So,
if you could think of like one thing that a regular Catholic could do to help either educate people about how to eradicate racism, you talked about policies, but that was more on the diocesan level. Like, what could I do to help get rid of this sin of racism?
Well, I think with like lots of sins is you have to recognize the fact that it's real, that systematic racism is real in the United States. There are people who deny that. They'd say, oh, everyone has the same opportunities, which is just false. I mean, just think of, I don't know, when I was in Tulsa, it seemed like Broken Arrow was like the rich part of town, when I grew up in Oklahoma City, the Edmond schools had everything. But some of the inner city schools that didn't have the tax bases didn't have much. They're getting new scoreboards and new stands and things like this. I mean, you can just look at educational disparities in any context, and you can say that's a problem of policy. Okay, and those are the things which are the subtext of racism. And really what it is it's protecting the fragile white folks from having to confront the fact that maybe they don't want to mix or talk to black folks. Maybe they feel like, well, geez, if they're in my school, maybe they'll influence my daughter or something like that. Those are the sorts of things that kind of have to be dealt with. Just the acknowledgement. I mean, growing up in Oklahoma, I never heard about the Tulsa race riots until I left Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. Now, I didn't take Oklahoma history because of the way my dad was sick when I was in high school, and I had to switch schools, and one school offered it earlier, and then the other school that I was in offered it later in the year, and so I missed getting Oklahoma history. But I never heard about the Tulsa race riots, not Black Wall Street, nothing. And I think if there's one thing people can do is at least admit the fact that there is structural racism that's put in place, that's still active, and it's been here since our foundation. I mean, we've been doing it as white folks since we came here, dealing with indigenous people, dealing with, certainly people from Central and South America, and, people, black folks with slaves, all sorts of black indigenous people of color have been confronted with the fact that there is systematic, racism, or even better, white supremacy in place that has given me an advantage that other people just do not have. Owning that, just even as little bit of that as they can, and being open to learning more about how those structures actually work and operate is a huge, huge step in dismantling racism. But talk to your white friends about it and say, do you think there's still white supremacy in the United States? And I mean, Mike knows I can put that on Facebook, and I'll get, 5 people that'll say, I'll probably get 8 people that'll say absolutely, and 2 or 3 like, no, I mean, I grew up poor. I know what it's like to be poor. And they get all upset because you say a word like white privilege, but they don't understand how the system is stacked in our favor as white folk. Mm-hmm. And I think understanding that is the best thing, even if they can only understand it a little bit, because then you can say, all right, if you're at least a little bit interested, then let's read about what's going on, like reading Robin DiAngelo, I think is her name. I don't have my books in front of me, the book on white fragility, because white people don't want to talk about racism. It's a very uncomfortable topic. And since I have brother priests who are black African Americans who do a much better and a much more honest job of talking about racism in the church, that don't get called to give talks on racism because people know that they will immediately be dismissed as he's just the angry black guy. So they're not going to hear that. So they send me in with the first foray to go, last time I gave a talk, someone was all upset about, white privilege, and asked me about, well, maybe we need to do something as a parish, cross parishes. Sure, let's do something. They said, well, do you have a Knights of Columbus? And I said, no, we don't have Knights of Columbus. Well, why not? They're a great organization. I said, well, you need to study your history. I said, because they didn't used to let black folks into that. So black folks now have the Knights of Peter Claver. Well, they should just join Knights and we could all be one brotherhood. And I said, well, why don't you make the step and be a Knight of Peter Claver? And then you're really showing that you want real brotherhood, not come to me, I'm coming to you. But it's because we can kind of challenge with those little things of, we can find folks who just have a little understanding and then say, why don't you read this book and learn a little bit more? Why don't you see what's happening? And much like what we hear from Desmond Tutu or others, poverty in the world, it's created. We could solve it like that. We could solve hunger, fresh water, enough clothing and everything, but there's so few. There's a whole bunch of people, or a few people, who hoard so many things that make it almost impossible for others. But if we change policies and say, hey, you can't do that, and you have to share some of this with others, like the church calls us to do, then we take care of the poor of the world, right? So when we're dealing with racism, we have to understand that it is a race. I mean, we're all human beings, but to deny that there's any differences, that diminishes culture to nothing. But race is a construct, and until we had, slavery from Africa, and when the Portuguese really started that, slavery was for everybody. Anybody could be sold into slavery. And it made the Portuguese, the Spanish, all the groups that really got into slavery. They were white. They were they were better than these animals, and so they wrote treatises about this. And it's been 600 years, and we've still been trying to deal with those books written then. I mean, we even hear eugenics talked about today. Even last week, we heard it by someone who has a very large platform in the United States, who speaks frequently, and he talked about he talked eugenics, and it's real. But if you can get people to acknowledge just a little bit, and then say, well, let's read an article, let's find out what folks are saying, because one thing that we're finding with just through the video phone or the camera on your phone is that Black people have been telling the truth about their interactions with police, that it's a very different system for them. And if people can at least own up to that, then you can say, all right, let's see what policing looks like. There are lots of little avenues that you just got to know what's that one little point. And that's how we start to break that down. And then they say, golly, I've been complicit in this. I've done this. So
I read that book that you referenced, White Fragility. Oh, it's been a year or two ago. And it was a really powerful book for me to read. And I think part of it was sort of, I don't know, like I had to humble myself to sort of believe what I was reading and then recognize in me, and I do think that ability to at least admit that, like you were saying, that one little, even if we can just admit a little bit that we might have some racist tendency within us, then you kind of open the door. And I also wanted to say for our listeners, on the USCCB website, there's a whole drop down about racism and things that you can do to educate yourself. Some suggestions. I don't know. I just went on this morning and I thought that they had some really good materials also for parishes, or some suggestions. They have at times been very, they've been very vocal about that the sin of racism is a sin against human life. So, as we transition, before we move on to how you pray, I also, go ahead.
Yeah.
One more thing about that. I don't want anybody listening to think that I don't find racism in myself, because I am still growing out of the kind of programming that is put into my mind again and again and again. I mean, I still have plenty of racism in my own life that I still have to confront. This leading a parish for 9.5 years, that has taught me so much, but it's one of those things that I still get confronted with it, And that's a reality for me, and like the church calls us to, the constant conversion. One of the things that we have to do as white folks is keep our minds and hearts open to the fact that we still have racist tendencies, no matter how close. I mean, I have my nieces and nephews. My brother-in-law is an African American. I have nieces and nephews, and my brother-in-law who are part of it, and his family that are now part of my family, and then these Black folks here in my parish who are part of my family now. And to see racism hurting them, then when I kind of find it bubbling up at myself, I'm like, you got to watch out with that, And the nice thing is I have good Black friends. I can go to them and say, hey, this is something that happened, and golly, what can I do? But that's not something that everyone has.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that I was just going to say, that kind of realizing, for lots of white Catholics is something that Father Brian Massengale said earlier this year. He said, the only reason for racism's persistence is that white people continue to benefit from it. Mm-hmm. Okay, just listen to that. The only reason for racism's persistence is that white people continue to benefit from it.
That's hard.
That is a very challenging thing. And if you want to talk about prayer, that's what I pray about. Mm-hmm. Is how do I do that? I didn't mean to make the transition for you. You probably had a more smooth transition.
That's awesome.
That, so.
That's awesome. I was, that is a different perspective on prayer. Have you changed as a prayer in the past 9 years?
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, very much so. Yeah, very much so. With, they used to say Pope John Paul the second, when he would be at some mass or something, his face would get all contorted, and they would say, well, Holy Father, why does it look like you're in such pain? He says, because I'm just imagining all of the things that people are going through and praying for them. Now, the reality, of course, is that I have people who are within my grasp, who, the homeless guys who help out around the parish, to the wealthier parishioners of mine who, when they go into a store, are asked if they're there to clean, or, followed around a store even though they could own the store, sort of thing. For me to deal with those issues of my own privilege, because I've never had that, I know plenty of white homeless people, and that's not the thing. It's just that I also know that it's easier for me to realize the fact that I can walk in any store, any place, any hotel, walk in with the right clothes on, walk in like I own the place, and I won't get questioned once. I have people who are much wealthier than I am, who just going to a store, they get questioned. So for my prayer, when I get confronted with phrases like, Father Brian Massengale says, I have to realize that my own comfort comes at the cost of other people's pain, other people's suffering. Wow. I mean, I don't want to, I'm talking on an iPad with an iPhone right next to me, and you have your, Mac hooked up there, I can see. But the reality, of course, is that how computers and things get mined, the minerals that are needed to mine exploit people in Africa. Them putting the computers together exploits human labor in China. How it gets to us is through a massive marketing scheme, which tells us that we need it. And oh, by the way, there's a new iPhone coming out, so everyone get excited and get ready to pay, $1,000 for a phone, those sorts of things. And so my prayer usually comes from, how do I pull myself out of that comfort? Because that's what the Lord is calling us to. If we're going to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who clearly, it befuddles me to hear people talk about Scripture, and then I say, well, who God's favorites are. They're like, well, God doesn't have favorites. I'm like, no, try again. Well, how about the Israelites? No, try again. Well, Jesus is the favorite. Jesus is God, so you can't have yourself as your favorite. Who do you think God's favorite people are? If you read Scripture, through the Hebrew Scriptures, through the Christian Scriptures, who are God's favorite? Well, I don't know who. And I say, it's the poor. It's the marginalized. It's Anawim. It's the widows, it's the orphan. It's the people pushed to the edges of society. And one thing that I do in prayer is frequently think about how my own comfort gets in the way of me ministering to God's favorite people. Because, Matthew 25 tells us, it's the whole test. And here's the answer key. You want to know how to get into heaven? Give drink to those who are thirsty, give food to those who are hungry, all those things. Because every time you do it to them, you're doing it for me. So yeah, I don't give money as I walk down the street here if people come up, because, a white guy walking in my neighborhood, sometimes if they're new to the area, they'll be like, ooh, white guy, they'll always give us money out of guilt. I go, no, I will give it. But if you want to come back to the parish, I've got a little food bag. I'll give you some food, things like that. It's that sort of, what am I going to do to change the reality of the people who I work with, who are in my realm, and that's also part of, in all honesty, it's part of my work, not only here, but also my larger ministry. And I work with Catholic Relief Services to, raise money on behalf of the poor, because no matter how poor my guys are who come to me and look for $5 or something like that, or, a card to go to the grocery store and buy something, I know that the poor in the developing world have it much, much worse. They, literally, these guys know where they can go find a sink, clean up, drink some fresh water out of the sink. I know I've been to places around the world with Catholic Relief Services, and I've seen people who are like, well, the water is 1.5 miles, so we got to go get that. And then by the time we get it back, then we have to boil it, and then it has to cool down, and then we can drink it. I recognize how much better I have it. And really, any of your listeners who are listening to podcasts, no matter how poor they are here, in comparison, we have it great. And so my prayers definitely changed over these 9 years, because I keep going back to, what is it of my comfort that keeps my brothers and sisters poor? Because it's a construct that I participate in. Mm-hmm. Can I give you one statistic?
Sure.
Western Europe and the United States spend more on pet food. Okay, just pet food, not livestock, just your dog, your cat, that sort of stuff. We spend more in that on a year than it would take to give every human in the world enough to eat and drink.
Oh, gosh.
Added to the current programs. So all we have to do are some small policy changes that could make huge impacts on the world. Food and drink for everybody, secure food and drink for everybody in the world, for the amount of money that is spent in dog food, cat food, I don't know, snakes, whatever. We got St. Francis come up. Whatever pet you're going to take to church to have blessed, those. Not livestock, just your pets. And it's those sorts of things that we have to recognize. And then when you look at, although it's a number that's come down drastically over the last handful of years, but we still have 18,000 children die every day because they don't have access to clean water and food. I mean, Mike, I know you've got some kids, but I mean, if your kid's got a cold, it's not going to be the end of the world. They miss school. It's not going to be great. They're not going to feel good. The developing world, you get a cold and that could be your death sentence.
Yeah.
You might not survive. And we'll start seeing this, I think, more with COVID as it continues to spread. And we'll start seeing deaths like that. That's why, us as the privileged few have to say, how do I change? And that only comes through prayer, because it means sacrificing myself for the good of another. Like, St. John the Baptist said, I must increase so he can, I must decrease so he might increase. And that's what we have to do. If we really want to take care of our poorest brothers and sisters, it has to start with me, So.
Well, that is fantastic. Thank you, Father Vic. One of the things we ask our guests, would you mind leading us in a quick Glory Be as we close out the podcast?
Wait.
Oh.
We have to say.
Yeah?
Well, I would like to know, if you could tell everyone in the world to pray for one thing, what would that be and why? Maybe you already answered that. Maybe that's why Mike started to draw us to a close.
To consider my own comfort.
Yes, to consider my own comfort. Would that be it? Or
Right. Well, no, I would tell people to not only to pray for the poor, but understand what the poor are going through. Mm-hmm. And that's where the depth of prayer comes from. It's like a friend who gets cancer. Mm-hmm. Oh, will you pray for my cancer? I've got, small cell carcinoma type whatever. Well, you're going to go home and do research on that. You're going to hit Google and go like, what is small cell carcinoma? What exactly am I praying for here? Just look up the plight of the poor of the world. Look at the plight of the poor in your neighborhood. What does that actually look like? And then think, golly, do I need to change the way I act? Because that's we can pray for all that, but as Pope Francis says, this is how prayer works. You ask God to feed the poor. You pray to God to feed the poor, and then you go feed the poor because God's calling you to do it. That's how prayer works. So if you want one thing to pray for our poorest brothers and sisters, because that's your gateway to heaven. Spend all the time you want in Mass, which is very edifying, developing the soul, wonderful things. But if you're not out day in and day out caring for the poor and doing something about it, Matthew 25 lets you know everything you need to know. So pray for the poor.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much. That was just great.
Well, let us pray. Father Vic.
All right. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever will be, world without end. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Father Vic.
Oh, thank you so much.
We'll finish
it. Thank you.
Glory Be is a production of the Office of Communications at the Church of St. Mary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm your producer, Mike Malcolm. See you next week with Father Vic. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.